Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Let's drive Moab. In the spring of 2007, I went down to enjoy Moab. We have already looked at US Highway 6 and the train that was going through Helper and Price. When we first got to Moab, we went driving down Highway 279 to Potash. The next day, we went out exploring Highway 313 and Dead Horse Point. Dead Horse Point, where a very narrow piece of canyon captured some horses and they died listening to the river below them while they died of thirst. It upset the horses greatly, I'm sure, and I must admit, going out on that little point, feeling like at any time there could be an earthquake and the whole thing would break off and fall into the Colorado Canyon, left me a little unsettled. Today, we drive back to Highway 313 and head toward Canyonlands National Park. After dropping over what is called the Knoll, we drive for a little ways before we reach Canyonlands National Park. And we enter Canyonlands National Park 32 miles from Moab. There are lots of places to stop and look out over the scenery. And within a mile or two of having entered the park, your beer-drinking guide finds a spot where, as he is wont to do, he gets distracted from what we were doing. I told you we'd be exploring the Canyonlands National Park. However, I found this little dirt road going off to the side, and I stopped and read the sign. Now, folks, you may remember that the first day I arrived in Moab, I went down Highway 279 and at the end of Potash found a delightful little dirt road heading off into the distance. You may remember that I was intrigued by that dirt road, but I decided, well, I better go back and get a motel and think about that dirt road later. You may remember that I ended up being really glad I didn't take that dirt road, and I told you I'd be telling you that story at another time. You may remember that when we were looking at Dead Horse, we looked down and saw an extension of that little dirt road that I had decided that I was glad I had not driven. It turns out that when I was just outside of Potash, that road was called Potash Road. However, up here on the mesa and entering Canyonlands National Park, it is called Shafer Trail. This is what is labeled as Shafer Trail / Potash Road, going off into the distance from Canyonlands National Park. And lest you be thinking that Shafer Road be the good one that you see going straight off into the distance, no, my friends. The road going straight off into the distance is called the White Rim Road. The White Rim Road goes around the mesa that makes up Canyonlands National Park. It is 100 miles long. In a Jeep, they recommend 2 to 3 days to take it. If you're on a mountain bike, expect to be out there a little longer. From what I hear, the Shafer / Potash Road can be driven in a day as long as you have a high clearance Jeep and as long as you have some nerve. The Potash Road, as you can tell, is the little road that goes down Shafer Canyon and does not go straight out to the White Rim Road. Both of these roads follow what they call the White Rim. A layer of hard rock, the White Rim has formed a second plateau before you reach the Colorado River. The roads down there on the White Rim are 700 feet above the river, and they are 1,400 feet from where we are at the top of the canyon. Folks, it's that 1,400 400 feet that we're going to be considering. It's that 1,400 feet that convinced me I was glad I hadn't driven this little dirt road. And it is that 1,400 feet that the roads go along just fine and flat until all of a sudden they have to get to the top of that 1,400 feet. Here is the road approaching going up that 1,400 feet. This you will recognize as the view from where we looked at the White Canyon Road taking off from the Shafer Road. And this, folks, is how the road gains that 1,400 feet. Well, actually, that's how it gains about 1,300 feet. Once you get to within 100 feet of your goal, it just becomes too steep to go right on up, so it heads out over a little ledge. I didn't drive this, and I certainly would not have been looking at my odometer if I had driven it. However, I am guessing that this little road goes along for, 1 mile, 2 miles, something like that, hugging this canyon rim before finally you find yourself at the top of the canyon. At the top of the switchbacks, there's this informational plaque about this road. Since you probably cannot read it on the television, let me go through it for you while we look back over what it would be like to be coming up that road. Dropping into the canyons. The dirt road hugging the walls of Shafer Canyon below you descends 1,400 feet to the White Rim Mesa, then nearly 700 feet to the Colorado River. Indians were probably the first to use this route. Now it provides access to the White Rim Road in the backcountry of Canyonlands National Park. Travelers encounter hairpin turns, rock slides, and steep drop-offs. Today it's called the Shafer Trail. In the early 1900s, John Sog Shafer and other ranchers drove cattle down this trail to winter in the sheltered canyons. In those days, the trail was much more narrow and rugged, and cows sometimes slipped to their deaths. In the spring, the cattle were driven back up the trail to graze in upland meadows. The uranium boom changed the face of canyon country in the 1950s. The Shafer Trail was upgraded to accommodate trucks carrying mining equipment into the canyons and hauling ore out. With the establishment of Canyonlands National Park in 1964, the era of cattle and uranium here came to a close. Gadzooks. Herding cows up a trail that was not improved to a road. Double gadzooks. Driving a truck full of ore up this trail. And triple gadzooks. Mining equipment is heavier than ore, and going down a road is more dangerous than driving up it. Can you imagine taking the equipment down this road, maneuvering long, heavy pieces of booms and mining equipment around those curves? You know, there are several dangers to going downhill versus uphill. The most important one, of course, being that gravity is pulling you into it instead of you pushing yourself away from it. On a dirt road, you are pushing into the sand instead of pushing away from it. In a mechanical machine, you are using your brakes instead of your engine. If your engine overheats, you can always stop and let it cool down. If your brakes overheat, well, they lose their grip. Obviously, my dad and his generation were smart enough to know to stop and let the brakes cool down. One of the great things about disc brakes, which we use on cars now, is that they do work when they're hot, but the old drum brakes that people came up and down this road with, and people were taking mining equipment down this road with, is that the hotter they got, the less they worked. And once they weren't working, well, you were just SOL. The harder you pushed, it just didn't matter. Now, guys the age of my parents were running trucks up and down this, taking mining equipment down and ore up. They were doing it because guys my age were kids and being fed. Even so, guys that make their living this way, and the girls, we have to hand it to them. The sign observes that the ore taken out of here was used in the defense and uranium industries. I don't know how dangerous atomic bombs are, although I have some idea of it. I'm not sure how dangerous the uranium industries are, but I do know that just getting the ore out of the canyon was danger enough for me. And that, folks, is a look at the little road called Shafer Trail, which turns into Potash Road. A road I decided I was glad I didn't drive once I saw the far end of it. And a road that was worth distracting ourselves from our trip through the Canyonlands National Park. Next time we drive Moab, we'll go check out Canyonlands National Park, which actually starts at a little place called the Neck and takes us out to a grand island in the sky. Unlike Christmas time, when the rocket was delivered, this was a beautiful day for the big launch. There was the spectator gallery. There was the highly qualified launch crew. There was a specially trained retrieval crew. And as the moment drew near, the tension gathered. This is a hydrogen-powered rocket, after all. All NASA guidelines were carefully adhered to. This was a NASA event, the Neighborhood Associated Space Attempters. As the dangerous moment of hydrogen ignition approached, the crowds moved back from the launch site. The tension mounted. At least I think you'll find some tension if you look hard enough. The innocent crowd was not aware that this launch was such a threat to intergalactic peace that a highly secretive and most advanced of all blue UFO had been sent to keep track of what was going on.
The gas generation process is complete. Keep clear of launch area and press the launch button.
Here we go. On. Hey! Yeah.
Goodness knows we've heard lots about the origin of the species. Today, let's take a little look at the origin of God. There's one thing that all of these beings in the Great Wahoo have in common, and that is that they probably have a great propensity to believe in God. I can hear some folks saying, "Now, great beer drinker guide, how can you say that all of those animals have some propensity to believe in God?" And to answer that, I would say, well, let's look at what they have in common. We could look at the differences, whether they're covered with hair, or whether they're blue, or whether one lived a long time ago and one is a fellow we might see walking down the street today. But despite all their differences, their similarities are really much greater. For one thing, they are all mammals. They were born into a world that they had no idea what it was about. They were just here along for the ride with their eyes open and wondering what the heck is going on. What they do know is that when they wiggle, or when they squiggle, or when they wrinkle their noses, or when they blink their eyes, or when they cry, or when they clasp their hands, pretty well anytime they do anything, they get the world to shine on them. And that's pretty well the world they know until they get to where they look about like this. Now, I understand not all mammals are dressed up in little blue nighties, but all mammals reach the point where they are getting to where they're getting into things, their parents are tired, and all of a sudden the world changes. All of a sudden, out of the blue, comes a smack on the hand and the word no, and God suddenly appears in their lives. Of course, you and I know that the world or the relationship to the parent has not changed. It's just that the infancy has changed and childhood has begun. And in a greater sense of the lesson, we do have to remember that the smiling God that the earth usually provides on us, we do take for granted. It's only when things get upset that we really pay attention to them, and that is probably when infants of all sorts begin to get some idea that there's a God out there that they do not want to anger. And it doesn't seem to really matter much whether it's the mommy God smiling or the daddy God smiling, the daddy God not smiling, or the mommy God that is angry. Unless, of course, you're raised in one of those families where the mommy God is always giving you the cookies, but when you do something wrong, she says, "You just wait till your father gets home." If that is the case, then you might think that the smiley God and the angry God are separated by gender. And so life struggles along in its childhood, trying to understand what this glorious gift is all about. And, of course, we have a tendency to assume that it's about what we're about. Being human babies, we have some tendency to think that the world must be thinking like we do, and acting like we do, and making reason like we make reason. Even as children, we do understand that we are given to fits of rage, so, of course, we must assume that God does that. And as parents, we usually have to admit that despite our best efforts, we just might prove to our children that that's more or less true. Despite all the reinforcement about the great angry God, most of us do develop a sense of wonder and awe at what a mystery and magic this glorious gift of life and the glorious gift of the earth and the glorious gift of the sun are, and what a phenomenal thing it is to be a human. So we take this childhood reaction of, oh my goodness, the gods are angry, I have to appease them, and we interpret that into doing our best to say thank you for how glorious it is when things are good. For that reason, I think that we all have a propensity to believe in God. Needless to say, we all believe in God as we understand God. The sheep, the elephant, and the monkey, I'm sure, have a slightly different concept of God than I do, just as the modern dude has probably a different concept of God than the caveman did. Certainly we know that people who live in forests have different gods than those who live in river valleys. Those who live in agriculture have different gods than those who live without agriculture. But they are all basically the same god. This tendency for mammals, and I think probably for all the rest of life also, to try to understand the miracle that we are thrust into. And not only to understand it, but to keep alive the spirit and the sense of amazement and wonder and awe that we all experience when we're children, and as we grow we have a tendency to forget. And yet our sense of spirit, I think, wants us to not forget it. I think that we have a sense of spirit the same way we have a sense of hunger and a sense of sex and a sense of all of the rest of our senses. I really believe that we are spiritual beings just as much as we are beings of hunger and passion and anything else that creates this amazing gift. Having received the gift of living in the day and age we do, we have the gift of science. So as we grow, we can come to understand that the floods come because of melting snow, the winds come because of atmospheric pressure, the thunderstorms come because of the influence of water and atmospheric movement. And we can appreciate the glory and mystery of life for what it is and how it actually works, which is so much more phenomenal than thinking it's some daddy in the sky. But our ancestors did not have the luxury of understanding things as we do today. When the volcano erupted, when the storm blew through, when the earth shook, the only thing that they had was a memory of when they were a child and Daddy was angry, and if they could just appease Daddy, then the anger would stop. So, of course, their gods became angry daddies and Zeuses and all kinds of gods that explained the workings of life, and it worked just fine for them. Now, you'd think, being modern dudes, that pretty well anything that life threw at us, we could pretty well just handle and say, well, that's life. It's part of the mystery. I don't like this particular part of it, but what can I do? I guess I might as well go along with this too. Well, there's an old saying, you don't find atheists in foxholes. And the wisdom of that old saying is found in the difference between progress and growth. The fact is, folks, progress is a false way to look at how we experience life. In progress, you use something until you pretty well don't have a use for it anymore, or until some other shiny thing comes along to distract you. At which point you toss the old out into the heap of time, forget about it, and get on with your shiny new thing. Well, that may be our relationship with things, but it is not our relationship with life. To understand our relationship with life, we have to understand that life is growth, not progress. In growth, instead of tossing out the old, you grow around it. And indeed, your past becomes the strength that gives you the ability to celebrate the present. So instead of throwing out our babyhood and our youth and our young adulthood and our adulthood and our seniorhood, we continue to grow around them, remembering them, holding them in our hearts, holding them in our memories, and they become the strength with which we grow. They also become what we revert to when we find ourselves in a scary situation that we don't know how to handle. Our first reaction is to say, oh, all I have to do is appease the angry daddy, all I have to do is cry for mother, and I will be saved. Of course, if we find ourselves in a foxhole at this situation, we very quickly realize what we really better do is pick up our rifle and start shooting. Or, put another way, we put away our childish things and begin to think and act and grow as adults. But don't worry, folks. Even though we become the sophisticated dude that we are, does not mean that we are going to be getting rid of the great happy God, nor will we be getting rid of the great angry God. Rather, the gods will do what they always do, and that is they will morph and change into the world that makes sense to us. In our world, we're somewhat removed from whether the weather is good or bad. To get our food and our shelter, we've come up with another system to do that. I'm sure that you recognize both the great happy God and the great angry God in our own world. In our world, of course, it has to do with our checking account. Here is the great happy God when you are paying your bills, and here is that other God when you fail to send in the check. And now, folks, if you will indulge me, I would like to discuss an important issue. You know, a good friend of mine got married about a year ago. It was a beautiful relationship. The two of them just got along great. Everybody thought this was going to be a marriage made in heaven. And yet about a couple of weeks ago, I got a message from this guy that he was divorced and would like to talk. So I thought that was very odd, and we got to chatting, and it turns out that his wife, he found out after he was married, is just compulsive about never throwing away one of her fashion magazines. She has them from when she was a kid. She started moving them into their house, and it got to where they were being shoved out. I mean, there was no room for furniture. She was actually willing to give up furniture so that she could create another stack of fashion magazines. So finally he told her, honey, you know, you've just got to deal with this issue. And he gave her an ultimatum. He didn't like to, but he did. And he came home that night, and not only had she not started moving the fashion magazines out, but that, she was sitting there with 3 new ones reading them. So he left and he got a divorce. And unfortunately, as much as we believe in marriage and work on making them work, it was another sad case of 2 people breaking up because one of them had too many issues. And that wraps up yet another exciting adventure in the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you next week. In the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo.